So that Okay. Hi, good evening, Mayor Leonardis and Council. Shannon Suzik, 16407 Shady View Lane. I think it's interesting, I'm going off topic already, that people are being annexed against their will. I've found, and I think all of you have found over the years, that the most times that people show up to these meetings is usually when they're in opposition to something or they have a serious financial interest. So I do believe that where we live, and I live on Shady View, close to Peacock, that we're in one of the most impacted areas and the least monitored. And some of my neighbors came out a few weeks ago, they didn't tonight, and I do take some responsibility in their distrust of the town, because I encouraged them to speak out on 16362 Hilo Road a few years ago, because I told them that their voices would be heard, and they weren't. And so we've lived now with 3 years of construction. As Tom O'Donnell said at that time, that approving that single project would result in redeveloping the entire street, which it has. So a couple things that happen in the county pockets, or whatever we're calling it tonight. Things disappear. 4 trees were removed on Shannon Road in the last month, overnight. And I know that some of my neighbors are concerned about their ADUs or fees and permits, but there's a reason for that, and some of that is to protect what makes our town so very special. So I have a couple of things I want to show you that I think if we were in the town, we would have a little more oversight. This is the corner of Shady View and Shannon. It's for sale for $1.7 million now. It sold last year for $2 million. It has been vacant for 9 months. The fence went up, the sign went up for DeMatte, and then the sign went up to sell it. So $1.7 million. Weeds and rats are included in the price. Who's paying attention to that? I don't know. So I don't know if that's county or town purview. Here is a house that's also for sale, their backyard, 16479 Shady View. And that right there is the garage on Hilo that's being built. Here it is again, just a couple feet from the back fence. I don't know how that happened. But I'm going to ask tonight, regardless of your decision, that you do a couple things, if possible, as soon as possible. 1, amend the town code section 162035 to revise the construction hours to match the unincorporated county. Or if you do annex at these pockets, at least, I have a couple other ideas if anyone wants to ask me questions, because I guess I've only got a couple seconds left. No Sundays, no holiday construction. Right now we have 13 hours a day, 7 days a week in these areas because of the difference in the construction hours.
Thank you, Ms. Suzik. We'll see if council has any questions for you.
Okay, sorry.
Councilmember Sayok.
I'd like to hear some of the, I'm not sure how many you have, but I'd like to hear at least
I just have a couple. The other idea I had, the other concept, I'm not sure if you can amend that code for the construction hours tonight, but it would bring a lot of peace to the neighborhood because it is consistent and constant, and those laws are being abused by certain developers. I also thought it would be a good idea to create an ad hoc committee to address the residential design guidelines and commercial at this point, but especially in these areas, because we're piecemeal, one by one, approving plans and projects. But when you look at the entire amount of space, just tonight's is 100 and some odd acres. That's 2 times the North 40, and we've got thousands of other parcels that are going to be annexed eventually. I think that the commissioner requirement should allow for at least 1 county resident on all committees until annexation is complete to provide important feedback. And also, I believe that the fines for not following or not complying with the current laws and regulations should be increased, as we have. I know specifically on Hilo, there's been multiple calls, and it's a big waste of taxpayers and the town's time and money to have your compliance officer come out. Anyway, thank you.
Vice Mayor.
Thank you. Ms. Suzik, thank
Yes.
you. I could not tell from your presentation whether you're advocating for annexation or you're against annexation, or if you're undecided.
Well, I would say I'm for it because I would like to vote for all of you. And right now in the county, everyone that's saying they are being annexed against their will, who are you voting for? Who's representing you? You're not represented, except for by our supervisor that doesn't, has a whole entire county. So I would say yes, but I'll go with the majority. And I would just like the construction hours fixed, please.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, so that closes our public hearing on this subject. So we'll move to council for discussion and/or a motion. I will begin, I guess, by saying thank you for everybody who came in and weighed in on this subject. Interesting ideas were proposed this evening. There's really two parts to it. One is the actual differences in the codes, and one is the actual fees associated with those differences. There was a speaker who suggested a 3-year moratorium on the fees, it sounded like, for things such as a tree removal permit. And then the first speaker, I think, alluded to the fact that if he were still able to use his leaf blower for 3 years, that would be a nice thing. So that was kind of the food for thought this evening. I think the construction hours, which were mentioned, that is a whole separate public hearing. I think we have to amend we potentially have to have a hearing about amending our town code for our noise ordinances and our quality of life kind of things for that. So unfortunately, because of the way it is now, whether you're in the county or not, you've been hearing it. So I think in the future I will consider putting that on the agenda to see if we can help improve the quality of life for our citizens, whether you're in the county pocket or not. Vice Mayor. Councilmember Sayoc.
Okay. I had a question and potentially a motion, but I understand there's other questions, so I'm just going to ask my question first. Mr. Andrews, I remember at our last meeting on this that there was some discussion about your work with the county in making sure that there is a smooth transition after annexation. And could you please just remind me, I know that you and Mr. Paulson were working on some aspects of that transition, so could you remind me what those are?
That's correct. If the council were to adopt the resolution tonight approving the annexation, then that starts the transition phase where we would start to work directly with LAFCO on a few fronts. Director Polson has already started working with his counterpart on the county and the planning department there just to get an understanding of how many existing permits might be in the pipeline. I'll defer to Mr. Polson, but I believe last count there were actually 2 active permits in the pipeline right now. And then in working with LAFCO, we would then establish with the county a date that would then actually be the effective date of the annexation. We would then do a mailing to all 308 residents, again, just kind of informing them of the date of annexation and providing, kind of welcoming tools like we do with any new resident that moves to the town. We provide a welcome package with good information about how to engage with the town on different fronts, how to get in touch with different departments and things of that nature.
Councilmember Sayoc.
My question was actually quite similar, and so I wanted to get a sense of the time frame that this takes place. Is it months? Is it within a year? Just a general time frame?
It would be within months. Okay. So from the county's perspective, who are proponents of annexation, once they know an entity is willing to do it, they've been in the business of trying to get out of the business. And so Director Polson will work with his counterpart to make sure there's a smooth transition for anybody that's in the planning pipeline. And then we would pick what seems to be a reasonable effective date, and then LAFCO would make that the effective date.
Okay. And my other question, I guess it's more of a philosophical. A lot of comments, whether in writing or today, have been about just the democratic process. And so are there hearings that occur at LAFCO and or at the county? Because currently the pockets are being governed by their county representatives. So do they have an alternate hearing there, or is this pretty much it?
Through the state legislated streamlined process, you are the deciding body on annexation. If certain criteria are followed, the state, the county, and LAFCO basically ordain you as the hearing body for the annexation and give you sole authority over the annexation.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The issue of construction hours came up this evening. It came up at the last meeting. So I guess it's to Mr. Andrews, if we, the town, wanted to address the construction hours, i.e. reduce hours, is that something we could do? Did I hear the mayor is going forward with it? Where are we in that process?
So I will defer to either the town manager or Director Polson.
So at this point, this is not one of our ordinances on our priority list. However, it's a fairly simple ordinance, so working with our town attorney and our mayor, we could schedule this fairly quickly after the July recess. I think the question will be, what kind of construction hours the town might be interested in. And then just be aware that permits that have already been issued, they might state very specific construction hours, and so we would need to honor the construction hours already legislated in those permits.
Thank you. And to the extent that one council person can weigh in on it, I would like this issue brought to the council, and I would like us to re-examine our ordinance, keeping in mind, of course, that some people have vested interest.
So, Vice Mayor.
Okay, I'm going to try a motion. My motion is that the council adopt the resolution that's contained in attachment 1 of our staff report, making the determinations and ordering annexation of certain urban unincorporated islands within the town of Los Gatos urban service area, pursuant to sections 56757 and 56375.3 of the California Government Code, and making the following comments. I think we are conducting a democratic process. You're not voting yes or no, but we've had, I think, 3 hearings on this, and we are following the state law, which is theoretically enacted through a democratic process. So we are following those procedures, and we are giving those people a chance to be heard. With respect to construction hours or beekeeping, we're not going to be able to address those tonight. I've heard, I think, both of them being put on future agendas. With respect to permitting and fees, what I've heard and what I understand from the town from this meeting and last meeting is that town officials are going to be working diligently with county to make sure that it's a smooth and fair transition, that things that are in process are not going to be stopped, that fees are not going to change in the middle of the road, or that rules are not going to change in the middle of the road. What I heard last meeting as well, and what I'm sure the council expects, and the staff I'm sure is prepared to carry out, is that the council or the staff in the town will not be going out and searching for things that people are doing who are in a pocket one day and not in a pocket the next day, and tell them to do something different. This is, the notion is that this is welcoming, that we want everybody who actually, I'm sure, thinks of themselves, if they go out and meet somebody at the coffee shop and say, where are you from? They say Los Gatos, whether they live in a pocket or not. So we're actually bringing you into the town, making you a full participant in the town, giving you an official voice in the town, and making sure that the services that the town delivers are delivered in a more efficient and effective way pursuant to state law, and also that the town gets back those property and revenue resources that are being expended per this town staff report on those properties that are currently pockets. So I hope that those of you who are currently opposing it will look at the information that we got from staff, that will reach out to staff and find out, and I know that we'll answer questions, and find out what exactly this means for you and how that transition can be managed as smoothly as possible. But given that, welcome to Los Gatos, I hope, if there is a vote on this tonight, and that my motion is that we approve the annexation.
I will second. Discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. It passes unanimously. Welcome to Los Gatos officially. We will move on to item number 18, which is consideration. Excuse me, I got to get to the right page. Consider the proposed amendments and introduction of a draft ordinance by title only to amend Chapter 29 of the zoning regulations regarding fences, hedges, and walls. Mr. Mullen, will you be delivering the staff report?
Thank you. Townwide amendments regarding fences, hedges, and walls were adopted by the council in December of 2018. Before you tonight is consideration of a draft ordinance introducing regulations for the hillside area of town. It includes the regulations contained in the existing ordinance adopted in 2018 and those specific to the hillside area. The draft does not introduce a permit requirement, but does include an intent and definitions section, requires perimeter fencing to be wildlife friendly on properties larger than 1 acre, prohibits solid fencing in the hillside area, restricts fencing from riparian corridors, allows for maintenance and or replacement of non-conforming fences and historic stone and rock walls, includes a section outlining penalties for unlawful construction, and provides a process for property owners to request an exception to the fence regulations. An addendum and desk item have been distributed that include additional public comments and an analysis of a perimeter fence area proposed by a council member. Staff recommends that the town council review the draft ordinance and introduce it affecting the amendments to the town code. This concludes staff presentation. We're available for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mullen. Do we have questions? Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We council received as a desk item a multi-page document that contained mathematical math and perimeters and numbers. And I'm wondering, are those yours? And is this something that you're asking the council to consider this evening?
So the equation, the answer to that question is yes, that was developed by staff. It was a first pass at the equation. It hasn't been fully vetted given the time that we had to work on it, but it's just an example of maybe the basic level of information that would be needed to develop the equation. Looking at it in more depth, there may be some modifications to this, and further analysis will tease that out.
So are you asking the council or suggesting to the council that if they should adopt the fence ordinance, that they include these calculations, et cetera?
I think the calculations were provided just in response to the request from the council member as a point of discussion. And one of the questions in that email to staff was if we went this route, what pitfalls or what challenges do you see with an equation like this? And that's voiced in the staff report just before all the tables.
So let me just clarify that this is really information for your consideration. It is not proposed as part of the draft ordinance, but should the council decide to take this path, these are examples of how it might play out.
Thank you.
And if it does take that path, then we'd have to come back with an amended ordinance.
An amended ordinance after we adopt one, or
No, amended meaning for the first reading, because it would be such a change, we'd have to come back for the first reading.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Rennie.
Thank you. I'll ask some questions, but I'll give the lead up first. So I was the one that asked for this, and the reason I asked for it was looking through the ordinance, it requires that a perimeter fence be wildlife friendly, but it doesn't say how far from the perimeter a perimeter fence is. So to me, it seemed like there was a problem to be solved. So being an engineer, I started thinking with math, and I realized this could have gotten too complicated. So this was a response to sort of my idea, and I read through the Planning Commission, and they had not included a width, in the past we'd call it a required yard was a terminology we used, that, it has to be 20 feet, it has to be 10 feet, whatever. And part of what they got hung up on is if you have odd shaped lots, let's say something long and thin, so if you compare a square and it's 20 feet, you don't end up grabbing all of the middle of it. But if it's long and thin and you have 20 feet on all sides, and your perimeter's longer, it seems like a lot more of the property can't be used. So my thought was, what if we had a required 10%, for example, from the 10% you then calculate how if the 10% total, then that ends up giving you how wide it would be, and the width is going to change. If it's a square, it'll be fairly big. If it's long and thin with a big perimeter, it gets divided up over more area, and so it would be thinner. So you don't. What I was trying to get to was, you never actually change the amount of property that the owner can't put a fence on, regardless of what shape his property is. That's what I was trying to get to. And thank you for providing these examples. You didn't provide enough to make sure that for me to completely understand. So maybe I will ask. That's the first question. Is it, if you did more of these, is it true that a square is going to have larger perimeter areas than something long and thin, given the same size? I mean, you did a square, but then you did long and thin, but it was a different size. So I wasn't able to make sure that I'm thinking through this correctly. So that would be my first question is that makes sense that a square, you can have larger required yards for the same percentage than you would of a long and thin?
I think the question absolutely makes sense. I think the equation provided may not accommodate that, and with more time, an alternative methodology may produce results where it's more equitable between a long, thin property or an odd-shaped property to arrive at that point, and then preserve that percentage of lot area that you would potentially dictate to be wildlife-friendly fence area. This equation is very simple, and there wasn't ample time to fully vet it. So if this is something the council would like us to move forward with, we may come back with an alternative method and an alternative equation to make sure that it's equitable and addresses each property shape fairly.
And one more question, and then I'll leave it to see if the council members are even interested. How would this be used? Would the homeowner have to use this equation themselves to figure out where their fence is going to be? And that would be, talking against my idea, one concern, that it would get too complicated for a homeowner to figure out how the frig big I'm supposed to make this required area.
When I first approached this, I was looking for as simple as possible so it could be done by the homeowner with just a few pieces of information. The idea being there's no permit process required by the draft ordinance, so it's hard to get staff involved unless the homeowner comes in and contacts us. It's hard to get staff involved to help them through a more complicated calculation like a floor area ratio or a demolition calculation. That was the first pass at it. If we return, the complexity may increase once we fully vet the equation and see if there's alternative methods that are more accurate than this.
Okay, thank you. I'll just leave it at that and see if other council members have questions.
Vice Mayor?
Okay, a couple questions based on that. Mr. Schultz, you already indicated to Councilwoman Spector's question that if the council decided to go this direction, it would have to come back at a separate hearing with a brand new ordinance, and we would start all over again. My question related to that is it a substantive enough change that it would have to go back to the Planning Commission?
No, I don't believe so. Only because they discussed this themselves and tried to come up with many different ways to try to do this and decided not to come up with this type of solution. So I don't believe it would have to.
And my second question, I guess, is to Mr. Mullen. If I'm a homeowner like me who can't do math, and now I'm left to my own devices to figure out where my fence is supposed to go, and just hypothetically I get it wrong, I don't need to get a permit, but can someone complain and now I'm in a code enforcement problem because I can't do math?
Yes.
Okay.
Go with Councilmember Spector and then Councilmember Sayoc.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm trying to just firm up in my own mind the current proposed ordinance. And so this is why we're making a statement and you telling me, Mr. Mullen, if I'm right or wrong. The ordinance requires a wildlife-friendly perimeter fence but I'm the property owner and I move a step back from the perimeter, put my fence there, and then it doesn't have to be wildlife friendly?
That's correct, and that's what the Planning Commission wrestled with.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Sayak?
So I'm trying to figure out, again, simple is better for me. What is the default? If we were not to look at any equation, what currently is before us, when I read it, I read perimeter, your boundary line, your property lot line. So what is the default as staff? How would you implement it should this be passed?
In its current form, the default would be, per the definition, that a perimeter fence is on the property line. Correct.
Councilmember Rainey?
I'll just ask the obvious question. We could, if we wanted, just picked a number and not, you just said every perimeter fence has to be at least five yards or 5 feet, or we could pick a number that says anywhere within there, and it would be simple, right? We could do that instead.
Excuse me. Yeah, that's correct. You could define a number where within X amount of feet of a property line, the fencing needs to be wildlife friendly, and then let the exceptions process work for property owners that have a unique situation that needs an exception.
Vice Mayor?
One more question about the perimeter fence. I know it's terrible. I was trying to figure out how to ask you an open-ended question, but is there any requirement in the draft ordinance that I actually have a perimeter fence? So
No.
I could determine that I'm just going to put a non-wildlife friendly fence within the parameters for where I can do that and not fence my perimeter at all, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
All right, seeing no more questions for staff at this time, we'll move to the public hearing. Samuel Shavitz, followed by David Wiseman.
Council members, thank you for taking the time to hear me tonight. I live in the hillside property up on Kimball Ave, just up behind the building here. It's a wonderful area. We love the nature. We love the wildlife that comes through. Really enjoy being in this town. And I think we all have very different philosophical views on whether we should be doing a fence ordinance and what are we trying to do with it and what are the objectives around protecting properties and privacy and safety and helping the wildlife live the safest, healthiest lives around us so we have them to enjoy. And so I don't really want to touch on that. I happen to believe that people should be able to have secure private homes. But I understand difference of perspectives on that. What I want to talk about is what makes a good ordinance. And I would say for our town, what makes a good ordinance is something that respects the character of the town, that is something that the vast majority of its residents are already following, and perhaps a minority of us need to be nudged into our better selves. So the leaf blower ordinance being a good example where it helps us be better. But most people are already following this, and most people are already taking advantage of this. So with that in mind, I took a look at the fence ordinance, and I spent some time walking around my neighborhood and driving a little bit around the other towns. And I wanted to give a rough sense. How many properties are currently in compliance with this regulation? Now, let's set aside the grandfathering, because I want to come to that later, but currently in compliance with this regulation. I think I looked at roughly 200 properties. I found a total of 0 that comply with the ordinance as written. The vast majority of the properties had one sort of good neighbor fence or another, one that was at the property line with their neighbors. And that included properties that were bigger than an acre. Often the houses are sited near one edge of the property. Maybe many houses are sited together, and so there's a privacy fence between them, so you're not staring directly into your neighbor's house or their yard or their pool area. In my particular neighborhood in Kimball Ave, every single property on Kimball Ave that I could see had at least one property boundary line fence, and most of them were truly solid. Larger properties, often, even if they didn't have a boundary fence, as you get up to maybe 3 or 4 acres, boundary fences get less common. But even then, they tended to fall against 2D, solid fences. Picket fences under this are solid. Anything greater than 20% area is a solid fence. Anywhere on the property can't have a solid fence. So privacy screens as you approach the driveway, anywhere on the property, if there's a solid fence of any sort, that violated the ordinance. So you would say, well, okay, that's great, but they're already there, and so they're grandfathered in. Or perhaps they're larger than an acre, although that only applies to the perimeter fence. That doesn't apply to any of the other fence types. I'm sorry.
You want to finish up your sentence there?
I'm happy to. I believe that as a democracy, we need to respect the minorities. And if what we're doing here is simply reducing the number of people that complain, people that are new to town, people that are going to do construction, there's fewer and fewer people impacted. I think it's our duty, as your duty in particular, as democratically elected representatives, to protect the minorities who are being set aside so there's fewer people to defend themselves.
Thank you. Let's see if you have any questions. Seeing none, thank you for your comments. David Weissman, followed by Alice Kaufman.
So this has been a long, arduous, difficult process full of compromises. Let me address one simple issue at the beginning. The definition of the riparian corridor is already in the hillside guidelines. It's clear, it's understandable. There's a new proposed definition in this fence ordinance. It's unclear. It talks about basically the drainage area that could come into a stream, and it's very nonspecific, and it also refers to another document. I say if it's not broken, then don't try to fix it. I think we should just keep the definition that we already have in the hillside guidelines. Now, the one outstanding issue, the amount of the setback area for the wildlife-friendly fence. So the Planning Commission agreed that perimeter fences shall be wildlife-friendly, but a perimeter fence is defined as located on the property line, move 6 inches into the property, and the fence doesn't have to be wildlife-friendly. This potential gaming of the whole process bothered Commissioner O'Donnell, who supported adopting specific setbacks on hillside lots greater than 1 acre. Those setbacks would be 20 feet on the side of lots and 25 feet at the rear of lots. He chose those numbers, those yard setbacks, because they're already in the town code. The Planning Commission couldn't come to a consensus on this setback. So can we find a definitive answer in science? We've looked unsuccessfully, but do have this indication from an article which was a literature review of design elements of wildlife crossing structures. In that study, overpass widths, overpass over freeways, over roads where wildlife could pass, those widths varied anywhere from 20 to 1,800 feet wide. We thus support setting setbacks in the 15 to 25 foot range. Combine 2 adjacent properties and the wildlife-friendly corridor could be between 30 to 50 feet wide. That corridor should be adequate to ensure achieving the goals of the hillside guidelines. And that could very easily be achieved by just changing the definition of a perimeter fence. Tom O'Donnell thought that it was better to set the setbacks and then have property owners come in and ask for and justify increased setback and lesser setback distances. And those are included in the draft. Odd-shaped lots, lots where the LRDA comes up to the property line, and various things. Again, most of this was going to affect what's coming down the line in the future.
Let's see if you have any questions. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. When you say that the 20-foot side and the 25-foot rear, I think you were talking about Mr. O'Donnell, they're in the code. Where are they in the code?
They are it's in our letter, actually. The section 29.40.270, where it talks about yards.
And it's talking about what about yards?
Well, those setbacks are the distances in which development cannot occur.
Thank you. And then you were talking about the riparian corridor already being defined in the hillside guidelines. How is it defined in those? I'm assuming that you have that information there.
I do. Riparian corridor, an area comprised of habitat strongly influenced and delineated by the presence of perennial or intermittent streams.
All right, thank you.
Vice Mayor.
Thank you. I'm going to do the same thing I did with Ms. Suzik. I don't know if you're here, but from your testimony, I'm trying to determine, are you in favor? Are you against the current ordinance? And what I'm hearing is you would like to have an ordinance, but you don't want this one absent the changes that you are suggesting. Is that correct?
We like this ordinance except for the omission of the perimeter fence setbacks.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you. Let me follow up on that. I have a piece of property to which this proposed ordinance would apply, and then you're telling me that you're suggesting a 20-foot side, 25-foot rear, and I'd have to put a perimeter fence. And let's say my property has an unusual configuration and I don't want to do that, or I cannot do that. So then what do I do?
You come into the community development director and you lay out your specifics and you say, my house is already within 10 feet of the property line because it was done years ago, or the only flat area I have is near the perimeter, and we want the community development director to give you an exception. We have been supporting these exceptions all along. We're not trying to make this punitive.
And do I pay the town for my chat with the community development director?
That's up to staff.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Mayor.
This may end up being for Mr. Mullen later, so you can just check it on your box. But the earlier discussion was that this ordinance does not contain a permit process, one of the reasons being that one of the town's priorities is to streamline. So given that, when and how do you anticipate that the community development director would be discussing fences with residents? Given my example that if I do my math wrong, all I get is an enforcement action. So how do you think that, how do you envision that you would come in and talk to staff if there's no permitting process?
I think staff has talked about time and materials in the past, and not having a blanket $500, $1,000 for the discussion at the counter, the permit, whatever.
Thank you, Mr. Weissman. Alice Kaufman, followed by Peter Donnelly.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. My name is Alice Kaufman. I'm with Committee for Green Foothills. So I want to mention, first of all, a few things that this ordinance doesn't do, right? It doesn't force anyone to change or remove their fence. It's only going to apply to new fences. It doesn't create a one-size-fits-all rule. It only applies to hillside lots greater than 1 acre. And as has been discussed, there's a very broad exception provision for anyone whose lot, due to size, shape, topography, needs an exception, or who needs deer-proof fencing for a vegetable garden that happens to be close to the perimeter, or privacy, security, so on. And it also doesn't, as you asked, it doesn't require perimeter fencing, and it doesn't prevent perimeter fencing. It just says that if you need to have a perimeter fence, if you want to have a perimeter fence, it needs to be wildlife friendly. And I was thinking today about this whole issue of perimeter fencing. And I grew up in the Midwest, and our house was on a 1 acre lot. And we didn't have a perimeter fence. The only fencing we had was around the swimming pool and the vegetable garden. And this was true for all of our neighbors. And I know this because my best friend lived around the corner, and we used to cut across backyards to get to each other's homes. So this was very common in many other parts of the country. You don't you don't throw a fence up around the border of your lot to demarcate where your property ends. You know where it ends. And I know that for some homeowners, marking the boundary of their properties with a fence is important. But a lot of the people who live in the hillsides moved there in the first place in order to be closer to nature. They wanted to be surrounded by trees instead of buildings. They wanted to hear birds instead of traffic when they wake up in the morning. And part of living closer to nature is allowing nature to live closer to us. One of the trade-offs that we make when we start building new homes in the wildland-urban interface is to respect the needs of the animals who were already there, who were there before us, and to allow them to access the habitat and the other things that they need for survival, because they do need it for survival. And the option, if we're going to fence off everything, is that we're not going to have the wildlife, we're not going to have the nature. And I think that's a very important issue to consider, because the development keeps on pushing out further and further into our open spaces, and it's taking a toll. It's having an effect on everything that lives in that area. So I think that this is an important thing to consider. The whole idea of perimeter fences, which we seem to be hung up on, I think is something that can be solved, because if you need to have a wildlife-proof fence close to your perimeter, you can get an exception for that. But the default should be, if you don't need to fence it off in a way that wildlife can't get through, please don't. So, thanks.
Thank you. Peter Donnelly. And after Peter Donnelly, it'll be Dashiell Leeds.
Good evening. My name is Peter Donnelly. I live at 15305 Seaview Drive in Los Gatos. I've lived in Los Gatos for nearly 20 years and went through the full new build planning process a few years ago for our house on Seaview Drive. When I first became aware of a new proposed fence ordinance last year, I was struck by how one-sided and punitive to property owners the draft language was. I spoke out against the initial language at both the Planning Commission as well as the Town Council meeting, and also organised a petition to challenge the proposal. After the proposal was rejected, and at the request of Joel Paulson, Director of Community Development, I agreed to meet with Mr. Weissman, who was the driving force behind the original draft language. At the beginning of the discussions, we were at total opposite ends of the spectrum. However, with an open mind and a collaborative intent, we found some common ground. In essence, we agreed that we should not be installing tall perimeter fences around every property to keep out the animals and restrict their movement, nor should we be hemming in property owners to limited parts of their property. Middle ground truly is possible if you can make the effort. Since then, a lot of work has taken place and progress made. The draft language in front of you represents the balanced proposal that protects the rights of property owners to use their property and allows for the movement of wildlife in our hillsides, with one exception. The current proposal has a fundamental flaw that could allow property owners to still install tall, non-wildlife friendly perimeter fencing by installing it just a few inches inside the property line. The Planning Commission failed to recognize or acknowledge this loophole in the language, and therefore I would ask that the Town Council seek to address this flaw before approving the proposal. I believe this matter can be resolved through the addition of simple rule language or a formula to designate the setback of non-wildlife friendly fencing from the perimeter. That said, please do not make this a complicated formula that's difficult to understand or to administer. I personally think setbacks consistent with existing building setbacks is the easiest way to tackle this, along with an exception process to say, if you have unique circumstances, an irregular lot, you can have a way to have your exception heard. If you have any questions about my comments, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, that's all I have to say.
We have a question. Councilmember Spector.
The Planning Commission punted on the setback issue.
Yes.
Because, well, I'm going to say because.
Oh, sorry.
It's a challenging, I think it's a challenging issue. And they probably wanted some fence ordinance rather than no fence ordinance. putting aside what the Planning Commission may or may not have been considering, when you say it's easy, have the setbacks consistent with the perimeter fencing has to be animal compatible as long as it's consistent with the building setbacks. What are those? How would I know that? How would you know it? How would that guy know it?
I know it.
But
because I went through the building process.
How would one know it?
Ignorance of the law is not an excuse. So I think anybody developing their property, it's incumbent upon them to ask, what can I do? I put a shed on my property a few years ago. I went into the town and said, how big a shed can I put on my property? There's no permit required to put a shed on your property, but I asked. So I think as property owners, it's incumbent upon us to ask before you go develop. Every person knows that there are rules around what you can and can't do. This would be a simple one to communicate. A little leaflet inside the town planning office saying all you need to know about fences. That could be pretty simple.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Dashell leads, and then after Dashell will be Don Wimbley.
Hello, my name is Dashell Leeds. I'm a volunteer environmental advocate for the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society. I'm here to speak today in favor of the proposed draft. I think it accomplishes a lot. I especially like the riparian setbacks included. The definition could be cleaner, but I think that the protections are still afforded, and I think they're still functional. I know there's been a lot of talk of a fence setback, and if we are to be considering that, I guess I'll offer my opinion on it. I would be in favor of a very simple setback, perhaps even a flat setback. And I think for any lots that this could cause issues with, this is why we have the exceptions clause where they could come into the community development director and get their issues sorted out that way. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Don Wimberly, followed by Charles Schaefer.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. My name is Don Wimberly, 43-year resident of Los Gatos. Family has lived in Los Gatos since 1922. I live on a lot in the HR zone that is 1.4 acres in size. I want to say from that perspective that I support the council subcommittee draft ordinance that was developed first of the year. I support the Planning Commission draft ordinance. I attended all the Planning Commission meetings and observed your Planning Commission work very hard to do the right thing. They were hardworking, serious, smart, and realistic. They came up with a simple, straightforward, understandable, and enforceable ordinance, and I commend them. There was no punting. It was simply a struggle, as you all have certainly experienced in your rulemaking days. I strongly oppose using the building setback lines that have been proposed on properties under about 4 acres. That becomes very punitive. Case in point, the property that I live on, which is rectangular, but would be severely impacted by having fence restrictions. Our property has welded wire fencing, set back some distance from roads, as the draft ordinance provides. The final comment I would make is that since the developed properties can keep fences, are grandfathered, and since the undeveloped properties in the town can be closely analyzed and controlled through your design review processes at staff, planning commission, and council level, where you can impose CC&Rs as needed to protect environmental areas or create guideways for wildlife. I would suggest that there really is not a need to be overly restrictive and set your citizens up for a neighbor encounter, a neighbor-provoked code enforcement action, or building up fence without knowing that you have to check on where you can put your fence in this community, unlike most areas of Los Gatos, where you can simply build a 6-foot fence wherever you want. Thank you.
Thank you. Charles Schaefer, followed by Lee Quintana.
Hello. Thank you for listening to me. I'm a Los Gatos resident, been here for about 25 years. I'm also a Sierra Club member, and just wanted to say the Sierra Club strongly supports doing something in favor of wildlife-friendly fences. This thing seems to be getting drug out to where we're doing nothing. So we do need to come to a decision. And the animals definitely need our support. We're squeezing them, and it's not a good situation. So please do something to support wildlife fencing. Thank you.
Thank you. Lee Quintana, and followed by Julia Donnelly, which would be the last card I have. So if anybody else wishes to speak, please bring forward a card.
Lee Quintana. I had prepared a presentation, but listening to everybody's comments, I think I need to just respond to some of them. But basically, I am in support of a fence ordinance that balances the desires and needs of the property owners in the hillsides, as well as implementing the goals and policies of the general plan and the hillside development guidelines in regard to minimizing the loss of wildlife habitat and providing movement corridors. I don't think this ordinance accomplishes that. For one thing, I'm going to talk the difference between providing a movement corridor is the setback from the street or the setback from the property line. That is not the same as minimizing the loss of wildlife. Not everybody would put up a perimeter fence or even a fence that's 20 feet in. That is not wildlife friendly, but it is possible. And if that happened, you would have, instead of movement corridors that allow wildlife to get to the habitat, you would have the equivalent of if you had a street in the town, a sidewalk to protect pedestrians, but a fence that did not allow them access to the properties on the other side of the sidewalk. Both are important. And I think it is possible to come to a ordinance that provides flexibility for the homeowners in the hillsides, meets the goals of minimizing the loss of wildlife habitat, and providing those corridors. One thing I'd like to comment on is that my understanding of building setbacks is equivalent to what our zoning code calls yard setbacks, which basically in the hillside doesn't really apply, in my opinion, because in the hillside you're limited to where you can build based on the LRDA. That's the building setback area. So that's one thing. It doesn't make sense. Another thing, the use of 1 acre plus. In the hillsides, the minimum acreage, minimum square footage required even in an HR1 lot is 40,000 square feet. Therefore, a lot of R1 properties would not fall under this, and you could have a patchwork of areas where animals could get through and animals couldn't get through. I also have difficulty with the privacy fencing being prohibited and the requirements for exceptions. And I'm going to just throw this in real fast because at the last Planning Commission hearing, the architects got up and said, if the town wants to minimize complications of building, this doesn't do it because they're going to be coming in for more exceptions based on this ordinance is currently done. I think it needs to be continued and reconsidered so that we can accommodate everybody's concerns and meet everybody's. Everybody will lose a little bit, but everybody will gain more.
Thank you.
Oh, I still have 6 seconds. I didn't realize that. I was horrible.
No.
See if I have anything
Your
else.
time is up. Your time has been up, but we let you finish your comments.
Oh, it says 6 seconds on there.
Julie Donnelly, and again, this is the last card. If there's anybody else, please bring it forward at this time. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for your time. My name is Julie Donnelly, and I live at 15305 Sioux View Drive in Los Gatos, and I've lived in Los Gatos for nearly 20 years. I'm speaking in support of the proposal in front of you this evening, with the exception of the potential loophole language noted by other speakers. There's been a lot of dialogue on this topic over more than a year. The initial proposal of fencing did not include sufficient recognition of a property owner's right to use their property, and that is why I spoke out against the proposal and was part of a grassroots effort to challenge the proposal. This included organizing our direct neighborhood on Sioux View Drive, which combined covers nearly 30 acres of land, as well as distributing 1,000 leaflets and using Nextdoor to get the word out. Since that time, a lot of work has been put into coming up with a more balanced proposal. This proposal has the support of the Sioux View Neighborhood Group, again with the exception of the loophole noted by others. Assuming this matter can be resolved, I think the final product would be a good outcome that protects our hills, wildlife, and property owners. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question, Councilmember Spector.
Thank you. And when you say assuming that issue can be resolved, how does one resolve it?
I mean, it's been going back and forth for a long time.
Right.
I was very proud of my husband working with, I'm forgetting names now, but the two of them worked together to try and come up with a compromise because they were at opposite ends of things. I don't think there's an easy answer to move forward with this. And I can say on our land, we have harmonious, the wildlife are able to go through freely. We also have pets that are fenced in, but it's just, I think that there is a way that we can work together to do the right thing for the fencing. And I know that people with bigger properties sort of are looking at one issue versus smaller areas, but.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Donnelly.
Thank you.
All right, that concludes our public testimony on this item. We will close the public hearing and move on to council for discussion and/or motions. Councilmember Sayak.
So it's more a question of staff. I think there was a comment and referral to our riparian guidelines, and I know we do have riparian guidelines. Is that what is being referred to?
The definition in the draft ordinance refers to the Santa Clara Valley Water
Yes.
District's
Okay.
Guide for Land Use Near Streams. There is a riparian corridor definition in the Hillside Development Standards and Guidelines that could be swapped in.
Okay. And so that's something that could be an easy fix with this, should this move forward? Or
Yes.
Okay.
Well, somebody needs to speak. Councilmember Spector.
I can't stand the silence.
It's called dead air on television.
Yeah, that's right. Well, this may be more dead air, but conflicting thoughts, some more defined than others. One is that this proposed ordinance has been before the town, the council, the planning commission many, many times. And as I read the planning commission minutes, it was clear, they said it, that they were sensitive to the issue of the perimeter fence being moved a foot, an inch, or whatever, and then being able to construct something that was not animal friendly. So they were aware of that issue, but even though they were aware of it, they went forward and approved this ordinance to move up to us. So I understand that. I also understand with what many of you are saying is that it's not a perfect ordinance and there are some things that we should do, one of them being the riparian language modification that Ms. Sayak was just referencing, and the other one was doing something about the positioning of the perimeter fence if it's not actually on the perimeter. I'm conflicted in the sense that probably more of me than not would like to have the ordinance approved. I probably feel a lot like the Planning Commission did when they approved it and pushed it on to the council. So that's where I am right now. I'm very interested in what other council members have to say.
Councilmember Rennie.
Thank you. So I think you're hearing from everybody. They like the ordinance as is, with the one small issue and maybe the riparian definition changed. So that's really saying we should go with this ordinance. I did worry a little bit about the issue of gaming the system, as we've called it, but I stop and I also think that maybe we can go with it as is, because I think there's only going to be a few people that are really going to try to game the system. I think most people will say, oh, there's a fence ordinance. What does it say? Oh, on my perimeter, I'm supposed to be wildlife friendly. How many people are really going to say, oh, well, I really, I don't care, I'm going to build it 6 inches in? I think most people are going to follow the spirit of the ordinance without having to define it. If I defined it, I would not go with the 20 and the 25 we heard people saying, because I believe that's somewhere around 35% of a just over 1 acre lot that people can't use or can't put a fence on that portion of their property. And if you look at the calculations that were done for the requests on my math, 6 feet came out as 10% on a square lot. So you might do something like 6 feet, because I think 10% may be worth asking, but I wouldn't go to 35%, which some of the on a 4 acre lot, sure, but to keep it simple, you need to pick one number. So I'm kind of talking both sides of it, but it sounds to me like maybe I should just make a motion that we approve the ordinance as is, with the swapping of the riparian definition back to our hillsides guidelines.
Second.
Motion and a second. Councilmember Sayak.
I'll be supporting the motion. Just to clarify, though, that just swapping the language to affect our riparian design guidelines.
Further discussion.
It came out of the hillside guidelines is what we're talking about.
Right. What the language is what is in the Santa Clara Valley Water District, or is the language within the hillside?
The current definition refers to the Santa Clara Valley Water District. The proposal, as I understand it, is to take the definition in the hillside development standards and guidelines, which is adopted by the town, and replace.
Got it. Okay. Got it.
So the maker of the motion and the seconder are all on the same page, and staff is on the same page. We all know. Okay. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you. Having just explained why I feel one way and the other, I am supporting the motion because ultimately I'd rather have ordinance in existence than not having one at all. I'd rather have an ordinance in existence than having this issue go around and around staff, planning commission, council for months and years to come.
Any more discussion? Councilmember Sayak.
Just again, I'll be supporting the motion. And to reiterate what I think Ms. Kaufman said it best, the default is the wildlife-friendly guidelines that we're asking for. The intent is clear. There may be some gaming, but we're hopeful that by laying out the guidelines that we have here, that it follows the values that all our documents talk about, that it's made clear what our expectations are. We're also acknowledging that there's room for extenuating circumstances, and there's always chances for a conversation with staff to figure out what those are. And so given the many years that many of you have worked on it. And I thank you, because this truly is something that has been fun to watch. I think Mr. Mullen was new when he first started on this. But I appreciate the effort that many of you have put forward, and I look forward to seeing how this comes back to, and hearing any feedback that may be happening within the next couple of years.
All right, seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None. It passes unanimously. Thank you, everybody, for your efforts on that.
Excuse me, Mayor. I need to read the title.
Title in the ordinance. Thank you.
Ordinance of the Town Council of the Town of Los Gatos amending Chapter 29 Zoning Regulations, Section 29.40.030 through 29.40.034 of the Town Code regarding fences, hedges, and walls.
Thank you. Moving on to council matters. I will begin by saying that we lost one of our dear friends, Leonard Pacheco. He passed on. He was a longtime historical committee member that had a strong connection to our community, and I think he is a friend of all of us up here on council. And I would just like to wish his family the best during these times. We'll miss Leonard and his service to our community. And if any other members of council wish to share any comments at this time with Leonard, we will be adjourning the meeting in his honor this evening. And then we'll move on to the other comments. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you. I just wanted to share with the community that Leonard, there will be a memorial for him, and it's going to be on July 13th from 5 to 7 p.m. At New next door. And so for those of you who know, have known, and have appreciated Leonard, you are invited. And if you could please, if you do intend to attend, RSVP to dvangorder510@gmail.com. And if you didn't get that down, you can always watch a repeat of this show and get it then.
One more time.
Okay. DVANG order ORDER 510@gmail.com.
Thank you.
Does anybody else wish to comment on Leonard? Councilmember Sayoc.
It was a terrible shock to learn of his passing. He was one of my first tutors, I suppose. When I was on the Planning Commission, I served on the Historic Preservation Committee with Len, and his patience and his passion for this town and its beauty is something that I will never forget, and deepest condolences to his family. And it's a tremendous loss for our entire community.
Vice Mayor, excuse me.
I just wanted to echo that. Diane, my condolences to you and to the town. I had the privilege and honor of serving with Len Pacheco on the Planning Commission and on the Historic Preservation Committee. And his kindness, but also his tenacity in his quest for design and excellence was something that you really had to appreciate. And if any of you enjoy the view on University Avenue across from the newly redeveloped Old Town, where the Gap and Banana Republic are, that was designed by Len Pacheco. All the colors, all the paint, all the way it looks was designed by Len Pacheco. The courthouse in downtown San Jose, the old courthouse, was redone by Len Pacheco. So he's contributed a lot to the community, and it's truly a loss, and my condolences to his family.
All right. Well, again, we wish Leonard's family the best in these times, and we will move on to the regular council matters commentary. Councilmember Sayoc.
Since our last regular scheduled meeting, we had a Silicon Valley Community Energy meeting with updates from community members on building codes that will be updated this year and our opportunity to go green. And we had a cities association meeting as well where we talked about upcoming legislation. One item of legislation to note that may affect us, AB 11, that looks at redevelopment funds, will be a 2-year bill, so that's being held for until 2020. And then 1487, I know that's something that we're all concerned with. That looks like that's now being decided on by MTC and ABAG for future governance. So.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yesterday, I attended the Finance Committee meeting along with the mayor, and we were discussing methodologies of addressing our unfunded liabilities, specifically direct payments to CalPERS versus continuing payments into our fund. And the ultimate decision was to get a report from Mr. Bartel. That will be coming to the Finance Committee, our first meeting in August. Our goal is to come up with a recommendation and bring that forward to this council at the second meeting in August.
Thank you. As was stated by Councilmember Spector, I also attended the Finance Committee meeting yesterday and the West Valley Sanitation District meeting on June 12th. Nothing to report. I attended the Treatment Plan Advisory Committee on June 13th. Also nothing of substance to report back, as well as the Flame of Liberty Memorial dedication, along with Councilmember Sayoc and Councilmember Rennie. It's a beautiful dedication to our new Veterans Memorial outside the council chambers here. Vice Mayor.
Let's see, since the last council meeting, I attended the ABAG meeting in Oakland. I wish I had more to report on it. Unfortunately, it was really budget and planning for the year for ABAG, so no real information. If people want real information, I know that the council received something from Ms. Pravetti, which was really helpful about the regional housing needs allocation assessment process for the upcoming cycle. And I don't know if that's been published on the town's website or if we could somehow share that information, because the objectives that are contained in that are really something that I would be certain that the council and the community want to know about and be prepared to address and discuss. There was also a Conceptual Development Advisory Committee meeting last week considering a property on Los Gatos Boulevard at Torino de Flores, essentially across from where the North 40 is being developed as a mixed-use project.
Councilmember Rennie.
Thank you. Yesterday, I attended the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority Finance Committee, and then also last Monday, I attended their Risk Oversight Committee. And as the mayor mentioned, the memorial dedication, which I thought they did a really excellent job, and we had I think it honored Los Gatos, some of the people that came. Of course, we had Senator Bell and Evan Lowe and Mike Wasserman and Dave Cortese also came from Board of Supervisors, but we had National Security Advisor, former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster also spoke to us. I guess we had a private session also, and the former Assistant Secretary Peacock also spoke. So I thought it really honored Los Gatos with the high-level people that came to this. So it was a very nice dedication. I also attended the Silicon Valley Leadership's Sustainability and Energy Summit last Friday, and on June 6th, the VTA board met. The most significant thing was we approved the changes to the light rail project, extending light rail to East Ridge. Basically, the biggest change was they have a flyover that basically grade separates one of the intersections. That was extended to grade separate two more intersections, so a large portion of it. So effectively, we're going to be able to move their transit faster. So those projects and the changes to the EIR were actually unanimously approved by the board. And on June 5th, I attended the LAFCO Commission.
Manager Matters.
Thank you. On Saturday, please join us for the Almond Grove ribbon cutting. It will be at Wilder between Bean and Nicholson starting at 11:30. And then also on behalf of all of our staff, we also mourn the loss of Len Pacheco and his many contributions to the town. We express our deepest sympathies to the family. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will adjourn this meeting in honor, of course, in honor of our friend Leonard Pacheco. Good night, everybody.